Hi guys, it's Jeff at Slavens Racing. This video is about my top 10 maintenance tips for the KTM 250-300 or the Husqvarna 250-300, and it also applies to just about any model bike, 2-stroke or 4-stroke, no matter what brand it is. And although it's I'm calling this the top 10, it might turn into more, 11 or 12, who knows. But so very first thing is wash the damn thing. I mean, this bike is just a little bit dirty. I went out the other day for just a few minutes and tested some maps. But if I was going to do much work on this bike, I'd get out the power washer first or run it to the car wash. I see guys all the time at home working on bikes that are absolutely filthy. And I can't do it. I mean, I can't even work on a bike like that. For one thing, you're fighting all that grit and grime the whole way, and then it's going to get into things where it's not supposed to be. So just wash it. Start there. Tip number 1. So tip number 2, and I'm going to stop with the numbering here, I think, but air bleeders. I'm surprised, but a lot of guys still don't understand this. And that is that forks build up air. So there's an air chamber inside the fork towards the top. And that chamber swells with heat. And so when the fork is, being stroked back and forth a zillion times a minute, it builds up some heat in there. The air expands, and so then you need to bleed the air out of the fork. So guys ask me, well, how often should I do that? Once a day, once a year, whatever? No, do it all the time. When I'm riding, not every time I stop, but quite often, if I'm stopped waiting for the guys to catch up, or maybe we stop to look at a map or something, push the button. Well, and then guys ask, well, should I do it with a fork fully extended, or can I do it while I'm sitting on it? Well, the answer is yes and yes. Do it however you want. If you're sitting on it, it's going to make the bike softer. So if that's what your goal is, then do it that way. If you just want to get the air out and maintain its current action, well then just kind of pull up a little bit and push on the handlebars and push down on the button. Let's see, from there, steering head bearings. Now wait a minute, let me get back to these buttons for a second, I forgot. So quite often guys I'll be talking to somebody on the phone about something else, and they'll say, man, I just bought some of those, whatever, you name it, brand of speed bleeders, of air bleeders from my forks, and I'm just blown away by how much air is in there. Every time I touch it, there's a whole bunch of air in there. Well, guess what? It's because you bought some cheap-ass bleeder that leaks. And by leak, I mean when the fork extends. So you compress the fork and then it extends. When it extends, it creates a vacuum. That vacuum sucks air in through the bleeder. That's because they're a poor quality bleeder and they don't seal well. I've tested a lot of them. I've seen some guys on the internet that even built little vacuum devices to check them. And the only brand I've ever seen that seals is the triple sealed STR bleeders. Yes, we sell them at slavensracing.com. I'm not telling you that just because we sell them, but we do try to handle the best of the best, and I consider STR fork bleeders the best of the best. They do not leak. You can put a vacuum tester on them. They don't leak. So from there, the steering head bearing adjustment. Especially when you get a new bike after you ride it a couple times, it's probably going to get a little free play in there, and most guys don't realize it, and they just keep on riding it until they've actually done some damage to the bearing race. I can feel a loose steering head bearing by pushing the bike less than a foot. I can push it, just barely move it, grab the front brake, and I can feel it if they're loose or not. Well, of course, I've been doing this forever, but I've also been able to feel that for a hell of a long time. When this adjustment is a little bit loose, the triple steering stem wants to move back and forth like this. And it's very small, very minute, but just grab that front brake as you're pushing your bike across the garage floor. grab that front brake real quick and see if you feel a little click in there, a little click, click every time you tap the brake. It's because this needs adjusted. So in order to do that, you loosen these 2 pinch bolts, the 2 over here, this one, and then you snug this up. That's how you do it on a KTM. On other bikes, there's an adjuster nut down underneath here. Japanese bikes use that method a lot. KTM and Husqvarna use this method. So then guys are like, well, what do I torque that to? Well, get over it, torqueaholics. This is not a torqueaholic moment. You have to do it by feel. So quite often it only needs to be tightened 1/4 of a turn, maybe a 1/2 a turn at the most, maybe a 1/16. I can feel a 1/16 if it's loose. I can feel that play. So loosen these bolts, pull this down by tightening it, that small amount. And it's a tapered bearing, it's a very tough bearing. The worst thing you can do by over tightening it is make it to where it steers hard, and then you know you've gone too far. But snug it up and retighten these bolts. Those are bolts that should be torqued, these ones here, and on the other side, this one not so much, but you can if you want. You definitely want to keep up on that though, because it will damage the bearings over time. Next thing I like to do, especially on new bikes, is wheel maintenance. I've got a separate video on that, because every new bike I've owned, I find at least a couple of loose spokes, if not more. And when I say loose, they're not flopping loose. They're just not totally tightened correctly. And you can watch our video on that to find out how to do it if you're not familiar with it. And then transmission oil. Guys ask all the time, what kind of transmission oil should I use and how often should I change it? Well, I don't really care what you use as long as you change it a lot. That's the main key. Just pick out a decent brand, Motorex, Bellray, Motul, Motorex, whatever, a good name brand, and then just change it a lot. Now, if you're running a Recluse auto clutch, then you might want to use the Motul 300V, I think it's called. Don't quote me on that, it's on our site. And Motul and Recluse is just coming out with a new oil designed for their clutches, so that would probably be the best choice. And as far as how often you change it, well, if you just go ride wimpy ass trails all the time, and you're cruising along 4th, 5th, and 6th gear, you're not putting much demand on your transmission oil. Your clutch is not slipping, you're not banging on the gears, so you can go a lot longer, maybe, I don't know, 500 miles or so. If you're riding super gnarly, tight trails to where you're slipping the clutch all day, the motor's running hot, maybe boiling over once in a while, the fan's kicking on a bunch, those types of trails, well then just use some common sense and change a little more often. Let's see, what do we have here? Brake fluid would be one of my next things that I like to keep on top of. You know, I ride a lot of bikes. People quite often want to ride my bike, so what happens is I end up riding their bikes. Or sometimes I just am riding with somebody and I see that I'm constantly struggling on things that aren't that hard, so I just ask them, let me ride that steaming pile and see what's going on. And I realize that they've stacked the deck against themselves by poor bike setup, poor choices on what they've put on it, and poor maintenance. So I absolutely detest mushy, sloppy feeling brakes. I like them to stay the way they come from the factory. Very responsive, and that's the way you should keep them all the time. So brake fluid is one of the main things that's going to help that, so change the brake fluid quite often. You know, if you're a racer guy and you're doing long events, enduros or GNCCs, where you're on that bike for several hours and you're just spanking it hard on and off the brakes all day long, I would change it after every one of those events. I would change the front and the rear brake fluid. If you're just a casual trail rider and you just kind of sit on your butt and turn the throttle all day long and don't really ride anything too gnarly, maybe once or twice a year. If you like to get out there and kind of romp pretty hard with your buddies and attack gnarly stuff and do some brake sliding and whatever, and you're on the brakes hard a lot, you're in steep terrain, so you're either going up or down, well, and you can make a decision there on how often to change it. But I change mine. I ride a lot of gnarly stuff, and I'll change my brake fluid about 4 times a year usually. Other thing I do is I don't run my brake pads down until they're metal. And I'm pretty easy on brakes actually, but you can see how thick they are stock, and I never run them down to below half of that pad material, just because when you do, they become mushy. Even if you rebleed them, they're a little on the mushy side. So I like to keep fresh pads in there. And you're probably thinking, well, I can't afford to keep fresh pads in there. Well, most guys who tell me that, I see all kinds of stuff on their bike that's totally useless. Orange bling stuff that does nothing, but yet they can't say they can't afford brake pads. Well, you might reconsider your priorities. Maintenance should be a higher priority than bling or some other useless thing that you read about on the internet. Just, having a good, fresh bike is much better than having a bunch of garbage on it. And then also make sure that you keep the free play here at the brake pad at a decent level. That's about right. That might even be actually a little bit loose, but I get on bikes and you push the brake pad halfway down before anything happens. Throttle free play. Same thing here. This is actually slightly sloppy. I'll be snugging that up a little bit. But guys will say, well, why do I have to worry about that? I mean, as long as I turn the throttle and the bike goes, that's all I care about. Well, so every time you shut off that throttle, you're going to turn it all the way forward. It's just a natural instinct. You shut it off going into a turn, then you got to get back on. So if it's got a bunch of free play in it, and you got to turn it a quarter of a turn before anything happens, that's wasted energy, that's a sloppy feel, and this is the number one place where you want a great feel. You don't want to have a bunch of slop on that to where you can't figure out where the engagement point is all the time. So keep it adjusted to where it only has I guess this one is in spec. It's supposed to be 3 to 5 millimeters of rotation. And I like it more on the 3 side. Let's talk about air filters. So there's a lot of newbies, and we get a lot of questions from newbies, guys that are new to KTMs or just new to the sport. And it's hard for me to remember back to those days because I've been riding forever, but their questions are valid and need to be addressed. So just things like air filters. They're like, well, how dirty is dirty? When do I change it? How often should I change it? Well, it's totally a judgment call. You just got to look at it and make a decision. So this filter right here is not very dirty. It's not worth cleaning. Most of the time, I'm the guy who knows the trails, so I'm up in the front. But if I was riding in an area that I didn't know and somebody else was leading and it was a dusty day and I knew it was going to be dusty, I would clean this filter. I would make sure I had the cleanest filter possible before I went on that ride. But typically you want them to get a lot dirtier than this before you change them. And I'll make a separate video on that because I see that done wrong a lot as well. The biggest problem being spray-on filter oil. I suppose it's good if it's used totally correctly, but most of the time it is not. Guys use it because it's convenient. They can just push that button and get it on there. But I do not use it. I do not recommend it. And I've seen a lot of damaged engines because of spray-on filter oil. Reason is it's a couple of reasons. It's not as tacky as regular filter oil that you have to squirt on there. They have to make it a little bit thinner to get it to spray out of the can. And then, but probably the bigger issue is guys don't put enough on. They just kind of spray around and, oh, that looks good, let's go. Call it good. Well, what happens is they suck dirt in their motor. I've seen a lot of engines that have been destroyed from spray-on filter oil. Fuel filters. So this is a fuel injected bike. This is a TPI model. Let's see, get some out of my pocket here. And on these, at this connector, this is where you can disconnect the fuel line to take the tank off. There's a very small filter in there that you should keep an eye on. You can just pop it out and blow it out with the air. And then there's another one inside the tank with the fuel pump, excuse me. And that's one is much larger. I think the factory says to change it every 40 hours. You can probably go a lot longer than that as long as you don't get a bad batch of gas with water in it or out of a dirty old gas can that's got a bunch of grit in the bottom. So if you're careful, that can probably last a lot longer than that. If you've got a carbureted bike, then you should just put an inline fuel filter in it that's clear so you can see it easily and make a decision on how often that needs to be made or needs to be changed just by looking at it. And let's see, guys talk about or ask me a lot about top ends. How often should I change the top end on my bike? Well, that kind of depends on a few factors. So there's the top end. So I'm a trail rider. I don't race anymore. Too old. And I actually just prefer trail riding. And I change mine at about, I put a new piston and rings in it about every 80 hours. I think a more common service point is more around 120, 125 hours. Seems to work out well for most guys. If you're racing, if you're a heavy, a hardcore racer and you're out there racing every weekend, I'd probably change it at 40 hours. And if you're a motocrosser on like a 250 SX or something, maybe even less than that. And 125s, those need to be changed quite often if you're racing. Now, if you're trail riding, not so much. And then as far as pistons, I really prefer the Vertex. They make the factory piston. It's a great silicone cast piston, very high quality, works very well. And I never ever change rings. If the rings are worn out, the piston's worn out. The piston went the same place that the rings did, up and down a zillion times. And the piston needs to be changed at the same time. I would never waste my time taking a top end apart just to put in rings. Let's see, what am I forgetting here? The clutch. Guys, I get lots of questions about clutches. Guys are always wanting to replace their clutch plates. And I'd say at least 90% of the time they're wasting their money because KTM clutches are extremely tough. The clutch baskets are extremely tough. The clutch plates are extremely tough. Extremely tough. And unless you do something like get it stuck in a horrible mud bog and just hammer the shit out of the clutch to get it out of there, you're probably never going to tear one of these up. We sell clutches, but we don't sell that many of them. And I think probably at least half of them that we do sell don't need to be replaced. If you have doubts about your clutch, if you bought the bike used and you're not sure, well then lay the bike on its left side, pull the clutch cover off, pull the plates out of the clutch. It's very easy. I'll make a video on that here one of these days soon. And inspect it. I don't know if the owner's manual has it, but the service manual has the service limits on the plates. You just measure them with calipers. It's really simple. Clutches are very simple on dirt bikes. Let me think what I might be forgetting here. Probably one thing that we should service once in a while is the starter system. Now, if you have like an 08 through 16, the starter system is mediocre at best. Even brand new from the factory, they were not so great. and they need a lot of maintenance. You should constantly take them apart and clean and grease all the gears, which are all behind these covers. This is a 19, so this is a different looking cover than what's on the older models. 17 through 19 all have this. That's another thing is, guys, don't get confused about what bike you have. I mean, 17 through 19 250s and 300s are all the same bike with mostly cosmetic changes. And then the 19s, of course, got the fuel injection, but still, 99% of the bike is the same bike. As far as skid plates, pipe guards, pipes, just whatever. So do a little research and figure out what your bike really is. And then the Bendix sits down in this area. So all you have to do is remove this cover and you can service everything very easily. There's the bushings in there as well for the Bendix. You should try to keep those maintained as well. And I think that's about all for today. So there is a new article in the May 2019 issue of Dirt Bike Magazine that you might want to check out. It has all these maintenance tips in it. Actually, it has most of them, not all of them. So if you want to review them in that magazine, and there's also a great article in there on the TPI models. We helped, or we worked with Dirt Bike Magazine on that. If you have any questions about any of these things, just drop me a line, info@slavensracing.com. And I think that's about all for now.